Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Very good. Welcome back. Welcome also to our many students attending these classes online. We continue with our study of Uddhava Gita. We begin the next chapter, chapter 8. I mentioned at the end of the prior class, we had finished chapter 6, and I explained the reasons we're skipping chapter 7, mostly because it's stories of the gopis in Vrindavan and a very odd segue to something on Kundalini Yoga and some very obscure and metaphysical things. Looks like an interpolation, I don't know. But for these reasons, we'll skip chapters. Also, I mentioned that the text is quite long, and if we want to complete our study of the text in the next couple of years, we have to be a bit selective in what we choose to study. So for those reasons, we begin today with chapter 8, and you can bring up the slides. Chapter 8, actually, a couple of things about chapter 8. One is, you may or may not remember when we introduced this text in the very first class, I mentioned that it was also called Hamsa Gita. Hamsa means swan. And you might wonder, where did that name come from? It comes from chapter 8. And in chapter 8, we won't see it today, but in a couple of classes, we'll see the section where Sri Krishna assumes the form of a swan, Hamsa, to teach Brahmaji and his Manasa Putra, his sons, in the form of a swan. So for that reason, Uddhava Gita is also called Hamsa Gita, because it's unusual to have, unusual to have this apparent incarnation of Sri Krishna in the form of the swan. Today, though, we begin with this section on Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Sri Krishna is continuing to teach Uddhava, following, as I said, following that really heavy metaphysical part that we skipped at the end of chapter 7. So how would Uddhava or anyone comprehend such lofty and complex spiritual teachings? Well, to study or learn to, let me set those words aside, to understand anything, we have to be ready. There's a huge issue in Advaita Vedanta, an issue of preparedness. We call it adhikaritva, and we used a technical definition here, is the state of being prepared, the preparedness of the student. If the student is not prepared, nothing goes in, basically. The metaphor I've given before, actually I turned it into a bad joke. A college student goes to his calculus class, attends every class, takes copious notes, and at the end of the term, when the exam comes, he gets 0 points on the exam. Why? The student has never studied algebra, geometry, trigonometry. In fact, he has a hard time with long division. The point is preparedness counts, and if preparedness counts in a college classroom, then it would count even much more so in this realm of spiritual studies, spiritual growth. So here, the particular aspect of preparedness we're talking about is a mind that is sattvika. I think all of you are probably familiar with the terminology sattva, rajas, tamas, these three gunas, qualities, and this represents an ancient worldview in which instead of looking at nature as being composed of matter and energy, they looked at the universe through the lens of these three gunas. Now, our topic, though, is not universe. So we're not going to talk about cosmology today. How the three gunas evolved into the universe is not our topic. But instead, these three gunas are used to describe the nature of our minds. Sometimes our minds, by the way, our minds are always a combination of these three gunas. There's never a time when your mind, well, I can't say that. Arguably, in deep sleep, your mind is perfectly tamasic. Tamas, as you know, is a quality of dullness, lethargy, darkness, ignorance, etc. Rajas describes a mind that is active or even hyperactive, extrovert, a mind that is very passionate and filled with desires, driven by desires. Not surprisingly, raga and dvesha are associated with rajas, rajoguna, for that reason. And finally, tamas is best, I think, in this context, in the context of the mind, sattva is best understood as a condition of purity. And purity in this context means freedom from rajas and tamas. So freedom from that dullness and darkness and ignorance of tamas, freedom from the extroversion and passion and desire of rajas, a mind which is pure. So that's a good way of understanding sattva guna in this particular context. Means other things elsewhere, but with regard to the mind, a condition of purity. You'll remember, of course, that in the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna also devotes quite a bit of the last third of the Bhagavad Gita is extensively involved with explaining these three gunas and the consequences of these three gunas. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Okay, obviously it's an important topic. Why? So we're talking about the mind having these three gunas. We already talked about preparedness. Another way of understanding that preparedness is, I made a note here of a famous statement that comes in the Amrita Bindu Upanishad. Not very well known, but it begins with this absolutely amazing statement, Mana eva manushyanam karanam bandha moksha yoho. We've studied this here before. Some of you are nodding your heads, you remember quite well. Wonderful statement that says that the mind alone, mana eva, the mind alone is the karanam, the cause for what? Bandha moksha yoho, for both bondage and freedom from bondage. Or to use simple language, the mind is the locus of the problem. And that's what Sri Krishna begins by talking about. The mind is the locus of the problem. What does that mean? Atma doesn't suffer bondage. Atma doesn't need moksha. Atma doesn't need Vedanta. Atma certainly doesn't need Swami Tadatmananda. So this is the idea. The problem resides in your mind. And if the locus of the problem is the mind, the locus of the solution equally is the mind. So the mind must be prepared. And Sri Krishna is going to talk about this preparedness in terms of the cultivation of sattva guna. So the importance then of these three gunas in general and the cultivation of sattva guna in particular, the importance can't be understated. Because unless the mind is prepared, unless the mind is sattvika, liberation, moksha, is absolutely impossible. Okay, that's enough introduction. Let us begin. Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha. I shouldn't use, that's a Bhagavad Gita melody. And we're using a more conventional chanting mode here. Sattvam rajas tamayati, sattvam rajas tamayati, guna buddhirna chatmanaha, guna buddhirna chatmanaha, sattvenanyata mohanyat, sattvenanyata mohanyat, sattvam sattvena chaivahi, sattvam sattvena chaivahi. So we begin here. Sri Krishna identifies, and this is what we just said, sattvam, rajas, and tamas. Iti puts them in quotation marks. These three gunas, are buddhehe, belong to the mind, intellect. Nacha atmanaha. How clear. They do not belong to Atma. The three gunas belong to the mind. Atma has no gunas. Atma is just consciousness. Just consciousness. The metaphor we've used so many times is consciousness seems to have qualities. Consciousness seems happy or sad. Consciousness seems active or disturbed or quiet. But those qualities all belong to the mind, just like the orangeness of this crystal belongs to the cloth. Because of the proximity of this crystal and the cloth, the orangeness which belongs to the cloth appears in the crystal in the same way. Because of the proximity, closeness of consciousness and mind, the qualities of the mind appear in consciousness, but don't belong to consciousness any more than the orangeness you saw belongs to the crystal. So this is the idea. Consciousness is pure knowingness, pure awareness. Actually, the commentator makes an interesting comment. He said, suppose sattva, rajas, and tamas belong to Atma. Atma, which we know is eternal. That which is eternal is necessarily unchanging. This is typical Vedantic logic. Anything that changes stops being what it used to be. So any kind of change, anything that changes cannot be eternal, unborn, uncreated, being subject to change. So if Atma embodies these qualities of sattva, rajas, and tamas, and Atma also is unchanging, as we just said, then you're stuck. If Atma owns the problem of bondage, there's no way to remove it. If this crystal were made of orange glass, there's no way to make it clear. Fortunately, that's not the case. The crystal is not made of orange glass, even though it may look orange in the same way. Consciousness may seem affected by the three gunas. Fortunately, it's not the case. It seems, but it's not truly the case. So, having made this clear, and this is such an important principle of Advaita Vedanta, and that is Atma is already Satchidananda. We use that term inner divinity. Your true nature is already divine. This is such an important principle, often not understood at all. And the failure to understand this very fundamental teaching is a huge problem. Here, at the very, very beginning of this chapter, Sri Krishna begins, he says, hey, this is it. The problem belongs to your mind, which is great news because we can do something about it. If the problem truly belongs to Atma, as I said before, you're stuck. It's hopeless. There's nothing you can do. You might as well go to the bar, drink away your problems, etc. Anyway, that's not a good solution, but you get my point. Okay, so Sri Krishna really makes this so clear. I have a note here. Those of you who were in our Upadesha Sahasri class last week, we discussed this very point of how Atma is absolutely unchanging. The example we gave then, an example I've given before, is when you wake up in the morning, you might feel dull. It seems like your consciousness is very dull first thing in the morning, but after some tea or coffee or shower or whatever, then your consciousness seems to be more bright. Well, the problem with that analysis is when you wake up in the morning, how do you know the presence of dullness? That dullness is known to whom? To a conscious observer. And when, after the tea and coffee, you feel brightness, that brightness is known to whom? The conscious observer, Sakshi, consciousness. That Sakshi, that awareful witness, doesn't get dull and bright. Not like, sometimes you have a 50-watt light bulb, 100-watt light bulb. There are no different wattages for consciousness. Unchanging. So, unchanging consciousness reveals the condition of your mind. Your mind might be dull, your mind might be bright. There's no dullness or brightness for consciousness. So this is how Sri Krishna begins this chapter by saying these gunas, sattva, rajas, tamas. Tamas is that dullness, rajas is that brightness. So by the way, if you drink too much coffee, lots of rajas. That kind of thing. So, sattva, rajas, tamas are qualities of the mind, which is great news. We can do something about that. Then what do we have to do? He says in the second half, sattvena anyatamao hanyat. Anyatamao, the other two being tamas and rajas, hanyat, one should remove, one should overcome. How? Sattvena. With sattva guna, you should overcome tamas and rajas. For our Sanskrit students, is there possibly an error in Sanskrit here? I'm looking at Vasanti very intently. When there are two things, shouldn't it be anyatarao? I'm sorry, I said anyatarao instead of anyatamao. In Sanskrit, we have these relative and superlative. Anyway, you can check. I'm being fussy here about Sanskrit. And by the way, don't think that any scripture or text is perfect in its grammar. There are all kinds of we can't call them mistakes. In fact, an interesting observation, they're never, ever called mistakes, because you can't say that there's a mistake in scriptures. So instead, we call them arsha. Now, arsha means that which comes from the ancient rishis. The ancient rishis lived before the rules of Sanskrit were standardized. So they can get away with anything. So anything arsha simply means non-standard Sanskrit. Excuse me for my grammatical aside, not very, not terribly relevant to most of you, and that's okay. Okay, let's pick up the thread here. Through the cultivation of sattva guna, you overcome rajas and tamas. This is brilliant psychology, because people ask Swamiji, how do I get rid of all of this rajas? How do I get rid of this tamas? And the problem here is you've started off on the wrong foot, so to speak, by making an enemy of tamas and rajas. Tamas and rajas are natural or unnatural? Natural, we all have. So when you make an enemy of your own mind, my guru, Puja Swamiji, used to talk about this. You already have, I'll paraphrase his points. He said, you already have so many enemies in life. There are family members that don't like you, extended family members that don't like you. I have to make that point. There are people at work who don't like you. There are neighbors who don't like you. If you're a Democrat, the Republicans don't like you. Like this. You have plenty of enemies in life. You don't need more, was his point. And we mistakenly do that. We make an enemy of certain traits and attributes of our own minds. Have you ever used this expression, I shouldn't, excuse me, I shouldn't be like that. I shouldn't be like that. First of all, it has that nasty word should, which is a very problematic word, very judgmental. And there's the American joke about people who use that word again and again and again. The American joke is a person replies, hey, don't should on me. I like that. Because it's oppressive. It's oppressive if you say, you should do this, you shouldn't do that, that's oppressive to the other person. It's oppressive if you do it to yourself. I shouldn't be like this. So tamas is present. I shouldn't be tamasic. Rajas is present. I shouldn't be rajasika. They're natural conditions of the mind. To turn them into enemies makes things harder and not better. We recognize them for what they are and deal with them pragmatically. And that's Sri Krishna's approach here. And that is, instead of turning them into enemies, you do in modern psychology, they would say this is good strategy. You cultivate what you want. In modern psychology, they say that you overcome habits by cultivating better habits. You overcome an unhealthy habit by cultivating a desirable habit. Earlier I joked, if you have the unhealthy habit of smoking cigarettes, instead of grabbing a cigarette, you should stick a carrot in your mouth, which is something healthy. This is how psychologists deal with overcoming these negative, undesirable mental patterns. Even psychologists are smart enough not to make enemies of them, but to use a different strategy. Just to make this even more clear, there's an expression we often use, shad ari, the 6 enemies. Of course, this kind of contradicts what I've just said. That is, that kama, krodha, etc., desire and anger and these other things do get labeled as ari, as enemies, in many spiritual texts. It's a common expression. But my point remains, and that is, if you set out to conquer those enemies, tell me, who's stronger? Desire and anger, or you? Who's likely to win those battles is not you. Kama and Krodha are likely to prevail. So the strategy then in overcoming these shad-adi, these 6 enemies in your mind, is to cultivate friends. Because, like in ancient times, if you have, even in modern times, if you have somebody attacks you, and then you assemble a huge army, an overwhelmingly large army, what do the enemies do? A nice expression, with the tail between the legs, like a dog, they wander off. So this is a strategy to avoid fighting a war. One strategy is to assemble an army which is of overwhelming size. And that's our strategy here as well, to deal with undesirable mental traits. You have to choose words very carefully here. To deal with undesirable mental traits, instead of making enemies of them, the best strategy is to cultivate desirable mental traits. And that is cultivating sattva. So by cultivating sattva, rajas and tamas get pushed out without fighting. It's like Gandhiji's strategy of nonviolent resistance. He would gather thousands and thousands of people together and tell them, don't fight. It worked. This works too. So instead of making enemies of tamas and rajas, we cultivate sattva. And how to cultivate sattva is what the next verse is about. The commentator observes that we have a series of 7 verses which talk about vidya, udaya, krama. The krama, the sequence or order in which vidya, spiritual wisdom, udaya, arises. So let's see that. Sattvat dharmo bhavet vruddhat. Sattvat dharmo bhavet vruddhat. Pumso mad bhakti lakshanaha. Pumso mad bhakti lakshanaha. Satviko pasaya sattvam. Satviko pasaya sattvam. Tato dharma pravartate. Tato dharma pravartite. Sattvat vruddhat. We have to connect the first and last words there. Sattvat, sattva-guna. Sattvat vruddhat. Due to the growth, vriddhi, due to the growth of, or development is a better word, due to the development of sattva-guna, by cultivating sattva-guna, what happens? Dharmaha bhavet. Now we're talking about the mind. And here dharma is not used in a sense of ethics or morality here. Dharma has so many meanings. In this particular context, perhaps the best way to translate dharma would be a spiritual practice, an inclination for spiritual growth. That's not a very common translation, but in this context, it makes sense. So, due to the cultivation of sattva-guna, dharma increases. Dharma in the sense of your commitment to spiritual growth. By the way, to be more committed to a life of spiritual growth means necessarily to be less committed to a life of chasing after temporary pleasures. So these are, it's like you can either, if the road goes north-south, if you're going one way, you're not going the other way. If you're going towards worldly pleasures, you're not going towards spiritual growth. On the other hand, if you are going north, driving towards spiritual growth, you are necessarily not going south in the direction of worldly pleasures. So, by cultivating sattva guna, your focus on spiritual growth will increase. Pumsaha, for a person, for any person who cultivates sattva guna, they will be on that path of spiritual growth. And here Sri Krishna gives more. He talks about this dharma, this commitment to spiritual growth, as being mad bhakti lakshana, this path of spiritual growth characterized by mad bhakti, devotion unto me. Of course, contextually, Sri Krishna is teaching this, so he's not going to talk about devotion to Shiva or Lakshmi or any other aspect of God. He's going to talk about mad bhakti, devotion to me. So this, on the spiritual development of sattva guna, leads you to advance on a path of spiritual growth, which definitely, in this context, involves devotion to Sri Krishna. And now the question, how do you cultivate that sattva guna? He says very clearly, sattvika upasaya sattvam. Sattvam, that sattva guna, arises how? Sattvika upasaya, by resorting to things and situations which are sattvika. They call it behavioral psychology. Whatever you're exposed to affects you. If you're exposed to things and people, you can underline people. If you're exposed to situations and people which are tamasa, it rubs off on you, right? You don't need me to tell you that. Same for rajasa. When you're with people who are very intense and greedy and all of this, it rubs off on you, whether you wanted to or not, which is why back in chapter 6 we talk so much about satsanga, because satsanga means association with people who are sat, good people, and certainly people who have a prevalence of sattva guna. So, by surrounding yourself with things which are sattvika, which means avoiding things which are tamasa and rajasa, by resorting to upasaya, by engaging in activities, by engaging with people who are sattvika by nature. Sri Krishna says, tataha, from that, dharmaha pravartate. Your commitment to spiritual growth increases. And what could be a more obvious example of that than what we do here every Saturday morning? Through this immersion in teachings which are sattvika, in this association with people who are sattvika, all of this affects us significantly and keeps us on that path of spiritual growth, which Sri Krishna here calls dharma. Then, dharmo rajastamo hanyat, dharmo rajastamo hanyat, sattva vridhiranuttamaha, sattva vridhiranuttamaha, ashu nashyati tanmulo, ashu nashyati tanmulo, hyadharma ubhaye hate, hyadharma ubhaye hate. Dharma, that being on that path of spiritual growth, hanyat, removes, overcomes rajas and tamas. Tell me, this is what do they call it? Rhetorical question. When I say tell me, I don't want you to stand up and tell me. But so rhetorically speaking, tell me, has coming, for those of you who are coming here regularly, tell me, has it affected you? I think the answer in the vast majority of cases here is yes. How can it not affect you? And of course, affect you in positive ways. And in particular, what kind of way? By helping you be more skillful at handling this rajas and tamas. Again, by cultivating sattva guna, which we do here every Saturday morning, you become less afflicted by tamas and rajas. A better term I used before. You become more skillful in managing the tamas and sattva in your mind. Again, they're natural. They're not your enemies. So, and this comes about because this dharma is sattva vriddhihi anuttamaha. It is this dharma, this commitment to spiritual life and spiritual growth, including coming here on Saturday mornings, is sattva guna vriddhi anuttamaha. It is anuttamaha, the best way of cultivating this sattva vritti. Vritti here means condition. The best way of cultivating a mind which is sattvika. And the best way is to stay on this spiritual path, come here on Saturday mornings, and not only that, whatever other spiritual and religious activities that you have in your life, all of those contribute. In fact, I would say if the only thing you're doing is coming here on Saturday mornings, it's not enough. Honestly, it's not enough. Okay, so this is sattva vriddhihi anuttamaha. This is the pure. Earlier we used the term purification. So a sattvika mind is a pure mind, but now we have to define purity. In this context, we can define a pure mind as a mind which is not pulled down by tamas, and a mind which is not made extrovert by rajas, a mind which is free from these negative consequences of tamas and rajas is a pure mind. A mind which is overcome by tamas is dull and stuck in a state of ignorance, and a mind which is rajasa is extrovert and driven by raga dvesha. And for that reason, Sri Krishna says, ashu, very quickly, actually I start in the final line, he adharma, he indeed adharma, dharma, he, adharma, sorry. He indeed adharma, the opposite of dharma. The opposite of going north is going south. The opposite of spiritual growth is becoming more addicted to worldly activities. These are opposites. You go one way or the other. So here that adharma is the opposite of spiritual growth. That adharma, nashyati, is destroyed by this ubhaye hate. When these two are destroyed, when when rajas and tamas are removed, the sattva guna that remains removes adharma, and this adharma, which is tanmulaha, which is the root cause of rajas and tamas. What is he saying here? Going in the wrong direction increases tamas and rajas. Going in the right direction decreases rajas and tamas. The right direction is spiritual growth. The wrong direction is immersion in worldly activities. There are very few cases where things are so black and white. In this, usually life is not black and white. In this one particular case, it seems to be true, however, you're either going north or south. You're either going towards spiritual growth or away from spiritual growth. Going towards spiritual growth means the cultivation of sattva guna, which push rajas and tamas out of the picture. Going the wrong direction means rajas and tamas increase and overpower sattva guna. Okay, let's continue here. Let me get something odd here. And this seems, odd is not the right word, unusual. It's like when somebody gives you a new dish to taste this. Tell me what you think. And you say, oh, that's very interesting. What does that mean? Well, this verse is kind of interesting. Let's see what happens here. Agamopa prajadeshaha, agamopa prajadeshaha, kala karma cha janma cha, kala karma cha janma cha, dhyanam mantro ta samskaro, dhyanam mantro ta samskaro, dashaite gunahetavaha, dashaite gunahetava. Start at the end. Dasha ete. Ete. These what? These dasha. 10. In that list that we've just recited are 10 what? Guna hetavaha. Hetu means cause. So these are 10 causes for gunas. 10 sources, 10 activities that produce gunas. And which gunas? There are only 3, but all 3 gunas. Now, it's interesting when you look at the list. This is the surprising part, the interesting part, where the list begins with agama, scriptures. So you're thinking, oh, sattva guna. And then apaha, water. What is that? Then praja, progeny. Are we really talking about sattva guna here? Deshaha, land, property. Kalaha, time, karma, the deeds you do. Janma, birth of your children. Dhyana, meditation. Now we're back to sattva. Mantraha, recitation of mantras, samskaraha, purificatory rituals, but doesn't look like all sattva guna, right? In fact, these are, by the way, if you count them, there are 10, not surprisingly. Each of these 10 activities can produce any of the 3 gunas. Now, you might wonder, why does he include agama, scriptures, etc.? Remember, the context was ancient times. Not just ancient times, but a very spiritual subculture in ancient times. So scriptural study would be a part of everyone's life, as well as meditation and mantras. So if this list were compiled in modern times, the list is meant to represent ordinary activities. And the point of this verse is every ordinary activity can produce either sattva, rajas, or tamas. We're going to see that in just a moment. If this list were done in modern times, I'm sure it would include watching television, checking your email, commuting to work, things like this. This is from ancient times. So let these 10 items represent typical worldly activities. Of course, they're not typical for our world. They're typical for ancient times. So to understand how could agama, scripture, give rise to sattva, rajas, or tamas. That doesn't make sense to us, and this is when we need a little help. So the commentary by Sridhar Swami, he actually has fun with this. He goes into each one of these. He says Shastra, first of all, and we'll go fairly quickly through this just to see how each one of these 10, and again, the message here is let me make this point very clear. Any worldly activity can result in the growth of sattva, rajas, or tamas, depending on your intention. Intent. Let me say that again. Any worldly activity, like coming to class in the morning, could produce sattva, rajas, or tamas, depending on your intention. So a sattvika intention is kind of obvious for coming to class. What about a rajasa intention? You're bored. Right? Boredom is a symptom of rajas, is it not? Absolutely. So you're bored. Let's go see what Swamiji has to say today. Tamas. You have a visitor at your home that you don't enjoy their company, so at least you can come here and get away from them for a little bit of time. You get my point, and that is, it depends on intent. The same action can produce sattva, rajas, or tamas, depending on your intent. Now, to see this particular list, our commentator says, what about scripture? There are some scriptures which are nivritti shastrani, scriptures which teach you to withdraw from the world and commit to spiritual life. On the other hand, he says, I shouldn't move my finger here, there are such things as pravritti scriptures. That is, scriptures which help you be more effective in your daily activities. You become more rich. And then he says there are also such things as pakanda shastra. Pakanda. What? What he mean? He's talking about interesting, misleading scriptures. And perhaps some tantrika scriptures could fall into that category. So scripture, the use of scripture in your life depends on your intention. Nivritti scriptures are sattvika. Pravritti scriptures are rajasa. And pakanda scriptures are tamasa. Then what about apaha, waters? Well, there are tirtha apaha, waters that come from sacred places. On the other hand, there is gandha udaka, water that is filthy. And there is also sura, alcohol. So obviously the holy water is sattvika, the dirty water is rajasa, and alcohol, tamasa. Then what about praja? Well, there are some praja who are nivritta, who are not so addicted to worldly activities and who are engaged in spiritual growth. But then there are praja, offspring, children, who are pravritta, who are very worldly, engaged in say addicted to money and advancement. And then there can be progeny, who are durachara, who behave badly. So children can come in these three categories, sattvika, rajasa, tamasa. Then what about desha? He says there are some deshas are vivikta desha, quiet, clean places. There are other places which are ratya. Means a place where roads come together, and it implies places that are very popular hangouts, they would use the term in English. And then there are also places which are Dyuta Desha, gambling places. So there are Sattvika, Rajasa, and Tamasa places. What about Kala, time? There are times like Brahma Muhurta, the most sacred of time. There are Pradosha times. This is like in astrology. I mean, talk about a bad, you've heard, oh, you shouldn't leave on your trip today because it's the wrong, or at this time, it's the wrong Muhurta to leave on this trip. And also there are times like Nishita at night. In the middle of the night is not a conducive time for most activities. Then there are different kinds of karma. Karma here, and here he gives a more traditional example. Karma here in a sense of rituals. So there are some rituals which are nitya karma. In ancient times, you'd be doing Agnihotra twice a day. But there are also rituals which are kamya, rituals which are done for a specific purpose, done for better crops, done for the birth of a son. There are also rituals which are abhichara. This is a so-called black magic, the tantrika rituals that can be done to cause harm to people. Then janma, different kinds of birth. You can be born as naturally, Vaishnava. Vaishnava is best, but not only Vaishnava. He says Vaishnava Shaivadi. Okay, so you can be born in a Vaishnava or Shaiva family, but na Shakta. It's a little biased here. So in ancient times, the Shakta means worship of Shakti, worship of goddess. In this particular context, it was associated with some kinds of tantra. That's why we're getting the commentator's opinion. His commentator's opinion depends on his time and place. At his time and place, Shaktism, worship of Devi, was sometimes associated with tantrika rituals. And the worst, so the born Vaishnava Shaiva is Sattvaguna, Shakta would be Rajas, and Kshudra, to be born into a very poor, lowly family, would be Tamasa. Then Dhyanam, meditation. What would be the best kind of meditation? Meditation on Sri Vishnoho, on Lord Vishnu, is Sattvika. This is very insightful here. But meditation on Kamini. This happens to a lot of people. When you fall in love, your mind gets stuck. And that's all you can think about, including when you try to meditate. So that would be Rajasa. And then your meditation could also be Vidvesha. You meditate on someone you hate, someone who has hurt you. They get stuck in your mind. There's a funny American expression, they stay in your mind free of rent. What a clever expression. So those you hate, when you hold on to that hate, they stay in your mind free of charge. Tamasa. Whose fault is it? Not theirs, right? You let them stay there. Then finishing mantra. So there are Sattvika mantras, Pranavadi, Om. There are also Kamya mantras that are recited to get what you want. And there are also Abhichara mantras, again, black magic tantrika mantras, which are used to hurt someone. Then what's left here? Mantra, and last one here is samskara. I lost my place here. Here it is. Samskara. There are samskara we think of as the rituals associated with certain stages of life. But the more literal meaning of samskara is that which purifies you. So what, he makes a very funny point also. So what needs to be purified, obviously, is your mind. So to engage in things which purify your mind, sattvika, to engage in things that purify your body, rajasa, and you'll be amused at his example for tamasa, to do things that purify your home. So sweeping the kitchen, which needs to be done. But you see how he's making these distinctions. Anyway, the point is, as I said before, ordinary, worldly, daily activities have consequences in terms of increasing sattva, rajas, or tamas, and it depends on you, depends on your intent. Now, that point is what's concluded here in the next verse. We'll finish with this next verse. Sri Krishna says, Tat tat satvikam evaisham, tat tat satvikam evaisham, yad yad vriddha prachakshate, yad yad vriddha prachakshate, nindanti tamasam taddata, nindanti tamasam taddata, rajasam tadupekshitam, rajasam tadupekshitam. So among those 10 examples of worldly activities, he says, Esham, end of the first line, among them, tat tat, whichever are satvikam eva, whichever activities which are done with an intent, underline that word, done with a proper intent, those activities become sattvika. So coming to class for the sake of spiritual growth, for that intent, it is sattvika, and yet those things, vriddhaha, the wise ones, prachakshate, the wise ones praise, worldly activities done with an intent of cultivating sattva guna. What about tamas? Nindanti tamasam tattata. Tat, whichever of those 10, which means whatever of your worldly activities are done with the wrong intent. No, I'm joked. Coming here on Saturday morning to escape some responsibility. Tamasam. And look at that. Coming to an Uddhava Gita class can be tamasa if your intent is to come to class for the sake of avoiding responsibilities. Then, what about rajasa? Rajasam tarupekshitam. The wise ones are upekshitam. They don't care about rajasam. Those that are in the middle are neither praised nor are they prohibited. They are, we'll say, tolerated. They're normal daily activities. I gave the example of samskara, washing, cleaning your body, even cleaning your house. These are normal things that you have to do. But if you're cleaning your body, actually, just a quick point here. Again, intent. So taking a daily shower is one thing, and this applies to young people more so. So a young woman who puts on lots of makeup and perfume and all of that to attract men, Rajasa, right? Or how about this? To clean your house because a certain guest is coming that you really want to impress. And you have a plan to manipulate that guest into giving you some money or something. And I'm just making this stuff up. Anyway, the point, though, is really clear and really important. Intention counts for everything. Throughout the day, we're engaged in so many activities. What is your intent while you're engaged in those activities? It's not the mere mechanical performance of those activities that's so important. What is more important, as Sri Krishna has said here, is the intent with which you perform some activity. Okay, it's a good place to conclude. We'll continue with our text next week. Brief announcements. Tomorrow, Sunday at 10 o'clock is our Upadesha Sahasri class, brilliant text of Shankara, and then followed at 11 o'clock by Satsanga. Please come with your questions. We'll conclude with our prayers at the altar. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Avamahe Kavim Gavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspatahana Shranvan Uddhavasira Sadhanam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururhatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsa Chanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadguru. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.